What if everything you knew about your family was a lie? In Whispering Hollow, Henry Collins fakes his own kidnapping to reveal a 50-year secret. When his golden retriever Max finds him tied to an oak tree, buried truths begin to surface. Hidden identities, ancient treasures, family betrayals. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe now to discover what lies beneath the Collins family tree. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling pastures of Whispering Hollow, a town so small it barely registered on the state map of rural Montana. Dew glistened on the tall grass as Max, a golden retriever with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that shimmered like polished copper in the sunlight, raced across the field. His ears perked forward, his powerful legs propelling him toward the ancient oak that stood sentinel at the edge of the property. The massive tree had weathered over a century of Montana's harsh seasons, its gnarled branches reaching toward the cloudless blue sky like arthritic fingers. Max's frantic barking shattered the tranquility of the spring morning. The sound echoed across the valley, startling a flock of starlings into flight from a nearby fence post. "What is it, boy?" Ellie Henderson called from the farmhouse porch, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. The elderly neighbor had been bringing her weekly baked goods to check on old Henry Collins, as she had done every Thursday for the past decade. Max's barking grew more urgent, a desperate plea that couldn't be ignored. Ellie squinted toward the oak, her heart dropping when she made out the silhouette of a man slumped against the trunk. "Oh my lord, Henry," she gasped, abandoning her basket of fresh bread as she hurried across the field as fast as her arthritic knees would allow. Henry Collins, 78 years old with a face weathered like the leather of his favorite work gloves, sat bound to the tree. His silver hair caught the morning light, and despite his predicament, his steel-blue eyes maintained their characteristic defiance. "Don't look so worried, Ellie," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper from hours in the elements. "I ain't dead yet." "What in heaven's name happened?" Ellie fumbled with the ropes binding him. "Who did this to you?" Henry's chapped lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "I did." "You what?" Ellie's fingers froze on the knots. "Called you over here to help me, didn't I?" Henry's eyes, still sharp despite his years, darted toward the farmhouse. "Need to get everyone back here. It's time." "Time for what, Henry? You're not making sense." Ellie finally freed his hands, noticing the rope burns weren't as severe as they should have been. "You need a doctor." "Need my family," Henry insisted, his calloused hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. 50 years I've kept this secret, Ellie. 50 years. Margaret went to her grave not knowing, and it's eating me alive." Max whined softly, pressing his golden head against Henry's leg as if understanding the old man's distress. "What secret?" Ellie whispered, the weight of decades of small-town history hanging between them. Henry looked up at the oak tree, then out across the land that had been in his family for 4 generations. Land that had sustained them, broken them, and ultimately defined them. "Get Carol here," he said finally. Tell her her daddy's in trouble." As Ellie helped Henry back to the farmhouse, the old rancher glanced back at the oak, knowing that what he'd set in motion couldn't be stopped now. The past was about to collide with the present, and the Collins family would never be the same again. Carol Collins Watson stood frozen in her classroom, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand. 30 years of teaching elementary school had equipped her with the ability to maintain composure in almost any situation, but hearing that her father was found tied to a tree had shattered that calm facade. "I need a substitute," she mumbled to the school secretary. "Family emergency." 15 minutes later, Carol's sensible sedan sped down the interstate, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. At 60, her chestnut hair now threaded with silver, Carol still possessed the determined chin and piercing blue eyes that marked her as Henry Collins' daughter. Those same eyes now blinked back tears as memories flooded back. Memories of a childhood spent under the big Montana sky, of a father whose love came disguised as stern lessons about self-reliance, and of the day 15 years ago when she'd vowed never to return. "He's manipulating you," her husband Frank's voice echoed through the car speaker. "You know how he is." "He's nearly 80, Frank," Carol countered, watching Spring Green Hills roll past her window. "Something must really be wrong. Or he's finally realized that property is worth millions to developers, and he needs you to talk him into keeping it," Frank replied, his accountant's practicality evident in every syllable. I'll come out this weekend. Don't sign anything until I get there." Carol ended the call with a sigh. Her husband of 35 years had never understood the complicated relationship she shared with her father. Frank saw the world in columns of numbers, assets and liabilities, profits and losses. He couldn't comprehend the invisible ledger of love, disappointment, and unspoken words that existed between Carol and Henry. As she turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to the ranch, Carol's heart squeezed at the sight of the weathered sign. Collins Heritage Ranch, Este, 1889. The white farmhouse looked smaller than she remembered, its paint peeling in places. The massive red barn needed repair, and several fence posts leaned at precarious angles. Max was the first to greet her, bounding across the yard with unbridled joy, his golden coat catching the afternoon sunlight. "Hey there, boy," Carol whispered, burying her face in his fur. "At least someone's happy to see me." He always did have poor judgment. Carol straightened at the familiar gravelly voice. Henry stood on the porch, looking friendlier than she remembered, but with the same stubborn set to his jaw. No hospital, no injuries, just the same ornery man who'd driven her away years ago. "Dad," she acknowledged coolly. "I heard you were in danger. And you came anyway," Henry replied, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Didn't think you would." "Of course I came. I thought you were hurt." Carol's voice rose with frustration. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" Henry's weathered face grew serious. "No game, Carol. It was the only way I could think to get you back here. We need to talk." "About what?" She crossed her arms defensively. "About everything I never told your mother. About what's buried on this land." Henry's eyes, the same piercing blue as her own, held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "About why you need to stay." Carol felt the weight of unspoken history pressing down on her shoulders. Whatever her father was hiding, it had been important enough to orchestrate this elaborate ruse. Despite her anger, curiosity flickered to life within her. "I'll give you one day to explain," she said finally. "One day, and then I'm gone again." Henry nodded, relief visibly washing over him. "That'll be enough to start with. Come on inside." Ellie made coffee. As Carol followed her father into the house that had once been her home, Max trotted faithfully behind, his warm presence somehow reassuring. Neither father nor daughter noticed the black sedan that slowed as it passed the property entrance, nor the driver who studied the Collins farm with calculated interest before continuing down the road. The Collins farmhouse stood as a testament to generations of hard work. Worn floorboards that creaked with history, walls adorned with faded family photographs, and furniture that bore the patina of decades of use. Carol ran her fingers along the familiar oak dining table where she'd once done homework, her mother's antique china still displayed in the corner hutch. "Everything's exactly the same," she murmured, accepting a steaming mug from Ellie. "Your father's not one for change," Ellie replied with a knowing smile before excusing herself. "I'll leave you two to talk." An uncomfortable silence settled between father and daughter as Ellie's car crunched down the gravel driveway. Max sensed the tension, circling restlessly before settling at Henry's feet with a deep sigh. Henry cleared his throat. "You cut your hair." 15 years ago, Carol replied flatly. "Right after Mom's funeral." Henry nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "It suits you." "Dad, what is this about? Why the dramatic scene at the oak tree?" Henry's eyes took on a distant look. "That tree was already old when my grandfather built this house. I proposed to your mother under it. And 50 years ago, during that terrible drought of 75, I found something buried beneath it." Carol leaned forward despite herself. "Found what?" "A chest," Henry said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Colonial era, by the look of it. Inside was jewelry, gold, pearls, emeralds, pieces that must have been worth a fortune even then." Carol stared at her father in disbelief. "You found buried treasure on our land, and you never told Mom." "I meant to," Henry defended, pain etching deeper into the lines of his face. "At first, I was afraid it might be stolen, that we'd lose the farm if I came forward. Then I convinced myself I was saving it, for emergencies, for your college fund. The longer I kept it secret, the harder it became to tell her." "Where is it now?" "Safe," Henry answered cryptically. "But that's not all that's buried on this land, Carol. There are secrets here deeper than any treasure." Before Carol could press further, the screen door banged open. She turned to see a tall man silhouetted against the afternoon light, broad shoulders, dark hair flecked with gray, and the confident posture of someone comfortable in their own skin. "Sorry I'm late, Grandpa. Traffic from Bozeman was." The man stopped abruptly, his green eyes widening in surprise. "Aunt Carol?" Carol stood slowly, recognition dawning. "Josh? My God, you were just a teenager last time I saw you." Josh Collins, now 30 and bearing a striking resemblance to his late father, Carol's brother, crossed the room in 3 long strides and enveloped her in a hug that smelled of pine and leather. "What are you doing here?" he asked, pulling back to study her face. "Your grandfather staged his own kidnapping to lure me here," Carol replied dryly. Josh turned to Henry with an exasperated expression. "Grandpa, we talked about this. Normal people just make phone calls. Would she have come?" Henry challenged. Josh's silence was answer enough. Max barked joyfully, jumping up to place his paws on Josh's chest in greeting. The veterinarian scratched behind the dog's ears with practiced ease. "So you're behind this too?" Carol asked her nephew. "No, but I'm not surprised," Josh sighed. "Grandpa mentioned wanting the family back together when I told him I was taking a break from my practice in Chicago." "A break?" Carol's teacher instincts detected the carefully casual tone. "What kind of break?" "The kind where your fiancé leaves you for your business partner and takes half your clients with her," Josh replied with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd come help around the ranch for a while." Henry nodded approvingly. "Land heals people. Always has." Carol studied the 2 men, her stubborn father and her wounded nephew, and felt the first genuine stirring of emotion since arriving. Despite everything, they were still her family. "I'm only staying 1 night," she reminded them firmly. Neither man argued, but as evening approached and they moved around the kitchen preparing a simple dinner together, Carol couldn't help noticing how naturally they fell into forgotten rhythms, how the walls seemed to exhale with relief at having the family gathered once more beneath the old roof. Outside, spring twilight settled over Whispering Hollow like a benediction, while somewhere beneath the ancient oak, secrets waited to be unearthed. The first light of dawn found Carol already awake, standing by the living room window with a steaming mug of coffee. She watched as Henry, moving slower than she remembered but with the same deliberate purpose, made his morning rounds to check on the livestock. Max trotted dutifully at his heels, occasionally darting ahead to investigate something in the tall grass before circling back. "He's up with the sun every day," Josh said, joining her at the window. "Won't let anyone else feed the animals first thing. Says they deserve to see the person who's responsible for them." Carol smiled faintly. Some things never change. She turned to face her nephew. "What aren't you telling me about why you're really here, Josh?" Josh's green eyes, so like her brother's had been, clouded over. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. "Besides the fiancé thing, I'm about $200,000 in debt," he admitted quietly. "The practice was struggling even before Melissa left. I took out loans to expand, bought equipment we couldn't afford. Then she took the clients, and..." He spread his hands helplessly. "I've got collectors calling. I had to get away to figure things out." "Does Grandpa know?" "Not the details. But he's no fool." Carol's teacher instincts made her want to lecture him about financial responsibility, but the defeated slump of his shoulders stopped her. Instead, she changed the subject. "What's this about buried treasure and family secrets?" Josh shook his head. "Grandpa's been talking strangely ever since I arrived. At first, I thought it was age, but..." He hesitated. "I found him studying old maps of the property last week, and he's been spending hours in the barn, going through Mom and Dad's things." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Carol looked out to see a sleek silver sedan pulling up beside her modest car. "Frank," she said with surprise. He wasn't supposed to come until the weekend. Frank Watson emerged from his vehicle wearing pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that looked ridiculously out of place on the ranch. At 62, he maintained the trim physique and precise movements of a man who believed control was the key to success. He surveyed the property with barely concealed disdain before spotting Carol at the door. "I wrapped up my meetings early," he explained, kissing her cheek perfunctorily. "Thought you might need reinforcements." "Uncle Frank," Josh greeted with forced warmth, extending his hand. "Josh," Frank nodded, his handshake brief. "Heard you left your practice. Tough break." An awkward silence followed as they entered the house. "So where's the old man?" Frank asked, checking his watch. "I've got a conference call at noon, but I wanted to discuss the AgriCorp offer with him first." Carol frowned. "What AgriCorp offer?" "They've been trying to buy up family farms throughout the county," Josh explained, his tone carefully neutral, "converting them to large-scale industrial operations." "It's a generous offer," Frank insisted. "More than fair market value. Henry would be set for life, and you'd inherit a tidy sum instead of a rundown property that bleeds money." "This ranch has been in our family for generations," Carol replied, surprised by her own defensiveness. "And now it's a financial anchor around your father's neck," Frank countered. "Be practical, Carol. He can't manage this place alone anymore." The screen door banged open, and Henry stepped inside with Max. The old rancher's eyes narrowed at the sight of his son-in-law. "Frank," he acknowledged coolly. "Didn't expect you till Saturday. Just looking out for the family's interests, Henry." "This family's interests have been my concern since before you were born," Henry replied, the steel in his voice belying his age. "And they'll continue to be long after I'm gone." The tension in the room was palpable. Carol felt caught between her husband's practical insistence and something deeper, something that tied her to this land despite 15 years of estrangement. "I need to clean up before breakfast," she announced, retreating from the brewing confrontation. In the sanctuary of her childhood bedroom, Carol opened the dresser drawer where she'd stored the few items she'd brought. Her fingers brushed against something cold at the back, a small key she didn't recognize. Beneath it lay a yellowed note in her father's distinctive scrawl, "Barn Loft, North Corner." Carol stared at the mysterious message, her heart quickening. Whatever game her father was playing, it was growing more complex by the hour. Outside her window, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a spring storm that would soon unleash itself upon Whispering Hollow. The barn stood like a weathered sentinel at the edge of the Collins property. Once painted a vibrant red, decades of Montana's harsh seasons had faded it to the color of dried blood. Carol approached it slowly, the mysterious key clutched in her palm, her footsteps leaving dark impressions in the damp earth as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The massive wooden doors groaned in protest as she pushed them open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the gaps in the aging planks. The familiar sense of hay, leather, and motor oil transported Carol back to her childhood, to hours spent watching her father repair farm equipment while telling her stories about the land. A rusted metal ladder led to the loft. Carol tested it cautiously before climbing, one hand gripping the key as if it might vanish if she loosened her hold. The loft was cluttered with the physical debris of family history. Old trunks, boxes of Christmas decorations, farming implements long rendered obsolete by modern technology. She made her way to the north corner, where a small antique writing desk sat beneath a circular window. Carol tried the key in the desk's ornate lock, her breath catching when it turned with a satisfying click. Inside the drawer lay a stack of faded photographs bound with twine. Carol untied them with trembling fingers and gasped at the image on top. Her mother, Margaret, her familiar warm smile bright against the black and white backdrop. But beside her stood an identical woman, the same smile, same eyes, same delicate hands. "Mom had a twin," Carol whispered in disbelief, flipping through photo after photo of the identical women in various stages of life. As children in matching dresses, as teenagers with their arms around each other, as young women with their whole lives ahead of them. Her name was Mary. Carol spun around to find Henry standing at the top of the ladder, his breathing labored from the climb. "You shouldn't be up here," she scolded automatically. "Your knees." "My knees have been bad for 30 years, Henry dismissed. "Didn't stop me then, won't stop me now." "Why didn't anyone ever tell me Mom had a twin?" Carol demanded, holding up the photographs. Henry's weathered face softened with an old grief. "It was your mother's decision. Mary disappeared in 71. Just vanished. The police investigation led nowhere. Eventually, they presumed her dead. But why keep it a secret? Why not tell me and Rob about our aunt? The loss nearly destroyed your mother," Henry explained, lowering himself with a wince onto a dusty trunk. "She said it was like losing half herself. She couldn't bear to talk about Mary, couldn't stand the questions. So we agreed. No mentions of Mary, no old photos around the house." Thunder rumbled outside as the storm gathered intensity, rain now drumming steadily against the barn roof. "What happened to her?" Carol asked softly. "That's part of what I need to tell you," Henry began, but was interrupted by the barn doors banging open below. "Carol? You in here?" Frank's voice echoed through the cavernous space. Henry's expression hardened. "We'll continue this later," he muttered, struggling to his feet. Carol quickly returned the photos to the desk drawer, locking it and pocketing the key before helping her father down the ladder. Frank stood at the bottom, his city shoes already splattered with mud. "There you are. I've been looking all over. The regional director of AgriCorp is on the line. They're offering an additional $50,000 if we can close the deal this month." His eyes narrowed suspiciously at the sight of Henry. "What are you two doing up there?" "Just showing Carol some old family photos," Henry replied evenly. "In the middle of a storm?" Frank's tone made it clear he didn't believe them. Carol felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward her father. "It's my family history, Frank. I have a right to know about it." "History doesn't pay the bills," Frank countered. "And your father has plenty of them." He turned to Henry. "Just got off the phone with the bank, Henry. They mentioned you've missed the last 2 mortgage payments." Henry's jaw tightened. "My business with the bank is my own. Not when Carol stands to inherit this financial disaster," Frank snapped. "Be reasonable, Henry. The AgriCorp offer is a godsend." A crack of lightning illuminated the barn, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. Max, who had followed them into the barn, began barking frantically, running in circles near the center of the dirt floor. What's gotten into him? Carol wondered aloud, grateful for the interruption. Josh appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from his dark hair. Storm's getting worse. They're predicting flash floods in the lowlands. He knelt beside the agitated retriever. What is it, boy? Max continued barking, pawing desperately at the ground. Josh looked up at Henry with a puzzled expression. Has he been doing this a lot? Started about a week ago, Henry confirmed. Can't figure what's got him so worked up. Another lightning strike hit somewhere close by, and the ancient barn shuddered with the force of the accompanying thunder. A deep, groaning sound emanated from the floorboards beneath them, and Carol felt the ground shift under her feet. Everyone out, Josh shouted, grabbing Henry's arm. Now, they barely made it outside before a section of the barn floor collapsed with a sickening crack, leaving a gaping hole in the center of the structure. The four of them stood in the pouring rain, staring in shock at what the collapse had revealed. A dark space beneath the barn floor where something glinted in the beam of Josh's hastily produced flashlight. What the hell is that? Frank demanded. Henry's voice was barely audible above the storm. That, he said gravely, is where the Rayall story begins. The living room of the Collins farmhouse had been hastily converted into a makeshift command center. Towels and blankets were spread across the floor surrounding the collapsed section, which had been carefully widened to allow access to the hidden space below. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder periodically shaking the foundations of the old house. Josh emerged from the hole, his clothes covered in dust and cobwebs, clutching a small metal box. His expression was a mixture of confusion and awe as he set it on the coffee table. There's a whole room down there, he announced, wiping grime from his forehead. Like a cellar, but it's not on any of the house plans. And it's filled with stuff, boxes, trunks, old furniture. Henry sat in his worn leather armchair, watching with an unreadable expression as Carol knelt beside the box. Max positioned himself protectively at Henry's feet, amber eyes tracking every movement in the room. Did you know about this? Carol asked her father, gesturing to the hole in their living room floor. I knew there was something, Henry admitted. The house always had its secrets, but I never found the entrance. Frank stood apart from the family tableau, his arms crossed defensively across his chest. This is exactly why the property needs to be properly surveyed and assessed. God knows what other structural issues are lurking. Carol ignored her husband's practical concerns, focusing instead on the ornate brass box. It was clearly antique, with intricate engravings covering its surface. A small keyhole gleamed on the front. It's locked, she observed. Here, Henry pulled a chain from beneath his shirt. A tiny key dangled from it. He'd been wearing it around his neck. This should open it. Josh raised his eyebrows. You knew about the box, but not the room? I found it buried under the oak tree 50 years ago, Henry explained. removing the chain and handing it to Carol. The chest of jewelry I told you about was there too, but this box, I could never get it open. Didn't want to break it. Carol took the key with trembling fingers and inserted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these decades for this moment. The lid opened to reveal a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. Letters, Carol breathed, carefully lifting the bundle. The top envelope was addressed to my dearest Margaret in elegant handwriting. The return address showed a name that made Carol gasp. Thomas Blackwood. Who's Thomas Blackwood? She asked, looking up at her father. Henry's face had gone pale. A man your mother knew before me. They grew up together. Carol untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, her teacher's eyes quickly scanning the faded ink. These are love letters, she said softly. Passionate ones. She continued reading, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Dad, these dates, some of these were written after you and Mom were married. Frank moved closer, his accountant's curiosity piqued. An affair? Well, that's unexpected. It wasn't what you think, Henry said sharply. Thomas and Margaret were childhood sweethearts. When he went off to Vietnam, she thought he'd died. His unit was ambushed, and he was reported killed in action. We'd started courting by then, and eventually married. But he wasn't dead, Josh deduced. Henry shook his head. He came back 3 years later. He'd been a prisoner of war, then spent months recovering in a military hospital. By then, Margaret and I had been married for 2 years, and Rob, your father, was already born, he said, nodding toward Josh. Carol continued reading, her hands shaking slightly. These letters. Thomas begs her to leave you, to run away with him. He says they were always meant to be together. Did she? Frank asked bluntly. Is that why there's a secret room full of hidden possessions? Henry's eyes flashed with anger. Margaret Collins was a woman of honor. She made her choice and stood by it. Then why hide the letters? Frank pressed. Because they weren't addressed to my mother, Carol said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper as she held up one of the envelopes. Look at the postmark dates and compare them to the photographs we found in the barn. These later letters, they were written to Mary, Mom's twin. A charged silence filled the room, broken only by the continuous drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Thomas and Mary fell in love after he returned, Henry confirmed quietly. Margaret arranged for them to meet, thinking it would help Thomas move on. Instead, they had an affair, Carol finished, the pieces falling into place. Henry's weathered hands clenched the arms of his chair. Mary got pregnant. In 1971, small-town Montana wasn't kind to unwed mothers. The scandal would have ruined all of us. So they planned to run away together, start fresh somewhere else. But Mary disappeared, Josh said, connecting to what Henry had revealed in the barn. The night they were supposed to leave, Thomas waited at the bus station. She never showed. Henry's voice cracked with emotion that had been bottled up for decades. Thomas searched for months before finally moving away. The police investigation went cold. We all assumed the worst. Carol looked from the letters to her father, a terrible suspicion forming. Dad, what aren't you telling us? The ancient farmhouse creaked around them as if it too were straining to hear Henry's answer. Outside, lightning illuminated the property in stark flashes, casting dramatic shadows through the windows. In those brief moments of illumination, Carol caught glimpses of her father's face, each flash revealing a man being slowly crushed under the weight of secrets kept too long. The rest, Henry said finally, his voice laden with 50 years of guilt, is what I need to show you in the morning. At the oak tree where this all began. Dawn broke reluctantly over Whispering Hollow, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick blanket of clouds left behind by the storm. The Collins property bore the scars of the tempest, branches scattered across the sodden ground, a section of fence toppled by the wind, the old barn looking even more precarious with its partially collapsed floor. Carol stood on the porch, watching as the first golden rays illuminated the ancient oak tree in the distance. The massive oak still stood proudly despite the storm, as it had for well over a century. In the morning light, it seemed almost sentient, a keeper of secrets waiting to be revealed. It looks different, doesn't it? Josh joined her, offering a steaming mug of coffee. When you know what's buried beneath it. Carol accepted the coffee gratefully, her eyes never leaving the tree. I keep thinking about Mom. All those years, she never once mentioned having a twin sister. How do you erase someone so completely from your life? Trauma makes people do strange things, Josh replied, his veterinarian's compassion evident. After Dad died, I couldn't even look at his fishing gear for 2 years. Just locked it all in a closet. Frank emerged from the house, already dressed in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt despite the early hour. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low but insistent as he paced the porch. I need those property assessments by noon, he was saying. Yes, I understand it's Saturday. No, this can't wait until Monday. Carol frowned at her husband's back. Throughout their marriage, she'd admired his pragmatism, his ability to plan for every contingency. Now, those same qualities felt cold, calculating. You ready? Henry's gruff voice broke into her thoughts. The old rancher stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Max sat obediently at his side, amber eyes alert. For what exactly? Frank asked, ending his call and turning toward his father-in-law. For the truth, Henry answered simply. All of it. The walk to the oak tree was slow, Henry setting the pace. Carol noticed how Josh instinctively matched his grandfather's stride, offering a steady arm when the terrain grew uneven. Frank hung back slightly, still working on his phone, as if maintaining physical distance from whatever revelations awaited. The oak's massive trunk cast a long shadow across the wet grass. Henry paused beneath its sprawling branches, his lined face solemn in the dappled light. 50 years ago, he began, his voice stronger than it had been in days. I found a chest buried here after a similar storm washed away some of the soil. Inside was the jewelry I told you about. Colonial pieces, probably worth a small fortune, and that lockbox of letters. Where's the jewelry now? Frank asked immediately. Henry shot him a withering look. Safe. That's not what matters here. Then what does matter, Dad? Carol pressed gently. Henry took a deep breath. When Mary disappeared, Thomas came to me, frantic. He was convinced something terrible had happened to her. The police found nothing, but Thomas kept searching. He became obsessed. That must have been awkward, Josh observed. Your wife's ex-lover living in the same small town, searching for her identical twin. It was hell, Henry admitted. For all of us. Margaret was devastated. She blamed herself for introducing them. Then, about 6 months after Mary vanished, Thomas came to the house late one night. He was drunk, raving about how he'd figured it all out. Henry's gaze drifted to the oak tree, his eyes clouding with remembered pain. He accused me of killing Mary, he said quietly. Said I couldn't stand the thought of another man having what looked exactly like my wife, carrying his child. Said he was going to the sheriff in the morning with evidence. Carol's hand flew to her mouth. Dad, I didn't kill Mary, Henry stated firmly. But Thomas was beyond reason. We fought. It was raining, the ground was slick. He fell and hit his head on a rock. A heavy silence descended upon the group, broken only by the soft rustling of the oak's leaves. He died, Carol whispered, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. Henry nodded, the weight of 50 years of guilt evident in the slump of his shoulders. It was an accident, but who would believe me? I had every motive the law recognizes. And if they investigated Thomas's claims about Mary, what did you do? Frank asked, his phone now forgotten in his hand. I buried him, Henry answered, his voice hollow. Under this tree, beside where I'd found the chest. Covered the grave and planted new grass. By then, people assumed Thomas had left town to escape the memories, just like they assumed Mary had run off to start a new life somewhere else. Josh ran a hand through his hair, visibly processing this revelation. Is that what this is about? You're confessing to manslaughter and improper disposal of a body after half a century. Not just that, Henry said, his gaze now fixed on Carol. There's more. Carol felt her heart racing. What more could there possibly be? The night Thomas died, someone else was here, Henry continued. Someone who saw everything. Who? Carol whispered, though a part of her already knew the answer. Mary, Henry confirmed, tears glistening in his eyes. She hadn't disappeared at all. She'd been hiding in the old hunting cabin on the back 40, too afraid to leave with Thomas because of threats she'd received. Threats from whom? Frank demanded. From my mother, Carol said suddenly, the final piece clicking into place. Mom threatened her own twin to protect our family. Henry nodded grimly. Margaret was terrified of the scandal, of losing everything we'd built. She never meant for things to go so far. When Mary witnessed Thomas's death, she made a decision that would change all our lives forever. Max whined softly, pressing against Henry's leg as if sensing his distress. Mary took Margaret's identity. Carol breathed, the impossible truth dawning on her. The woman I knew as my mother was actually her twin sister. The real Margaret left that night, Henry confirmed, his voice breaking. She couldn't live with what she'd done to her sister, to Thomas. Mary stepped into her life, becoming a mother to children who weren't hers, a wife to a man she barely knew. She did it to protect everyone, including the baby she was carrying. Carol felt the world tilting beneath her feet. So my mother, the woman who raised me, was actually my aunt, and my real mother abandoned us. Henry reached for her hand, his own trembling. Mary loved you as her own, Carol. She became Margaret in every way that mattered. Where did my real mother go? Carol asked, her voice barely audible. Henry turned toward the oak tree, placing his weathered palm against its ancient bark. She never left Whispering Hollow, he said softly. She's been here all along. Dawn broke reluctantly over Whispering Hollow, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick blanket of clouds left behind by the storm. The Collins property bore the scars of the tempest, branches scattered across the sodden ground, a section of fence toppled by the wind, the old barn looking even more precarious with its partially collapsed floor. Carol stood on the porch, watching as the first golden rays illuminated the ancient oak tree in the distance. The massive oak still stood proudly despite the storm, as it had for well over a century. In the morning light, it seemed almost sentient, a keeper of secrets waiting to be revealed. It looks different, doesn't it? Josh joined her, offering a steaming mug of coffee. When you know what's buried beneath it. Carol accepted the coffee gratefully, her eyes never leaving the tree. I keep thinking about Mom. All those years, she never once mentioned having a twin sister. How do you erase someone so completely from your life? Trauma makes people do strange things, Josh replied, his veterinarian's compassion evident. After Dad died, I couldn't even look at his fishing gear for 2 years. Just locked it all in a closet. Frank emerged from the house, already dressed in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt despite the early hour. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low but insistent as he paced the porch. I need those property assessments by noon, he was saying. Yes, I understand it's Saturday. No, this can't wait until Monday. Carol frowned at her husband's back. Throughout their marriage, she'd admired his pragmatism, his ability to plan for every contingency. Now, those same qualities felt cold, calculating. You ready? Henry's gruff voice broke into her thoughts. The old rancher stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Max sat obediently at his side, amber eyes alert. For what exactly? Frank asked, ending his call and turning toward his father-in-law. For the truth, Henry answered simply. All of it. The walk to the oak tree was slow, Henry setting the pace. Carol noticed how Josh instinctively matched his grandfather's stride, offering a steady arm when the terrain grew uneven. Frank hung back slightly, still working on his phone, as if maintaining physical distance from whatever revelations awaited. The oak's massive trunk cast a long shadow across the wet grass. Henry paused beneath its sprawling branches, his lined face solemn in the dappled light. 50 years ago, he began, his voice stronger than it had been in days. I found a chest buried here after a similar storm washed away some of the soil. Inside was the jewelry I told you about, colonial pieces, probably worth a small fortune, and that locked box of letters. Where's the jewelry now? Frank asked immediately. Henry shot him a withering look. Safe. That's not what matters here. Then what does matter, Dad? Carol pressed gently. Henry took a deep breath. When Mary disappeared, Thomas came to me, frantic. He was convinced something terrible had happened to her. The police found nothing, but Thomas kept searching. He became obsessed. That must have been awkward, Josh observed. Your wife's ex-lover living in the same small town, searching for her identical twin. It was hell, Henry admitted. For all of us. Margaret was devastated. She blamed herself for introducing them. Then, about 6 months after Mary vanished, Thomas came to the house late one night. He was drunk, raving about how he'd figured it all out. Henry's gaze drifted to the oak tree, his eyes clouding with remembered pain. He accused me of killing Mary, he said quietly. Said I couldn't stand the thought of another man having what looked exactly like my wife, carrying his child. Said he was going to the sheriff in the morning with evidence. Carol's hand flew to her mouth. Dad, I didn't kill Mary, Henry stated firmly. But Thomas was beyond reason. We fought. It was raining, the ground was slick. He fell and hit his head on a rock. A heavy silence descended upon the group, broken only by the soft rustling of the oak's leaves. He died, Carol whispered, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. Henry nodded, the weight of 50 years of guilt evident in the slump of his shoulders. It was an accident, but who would believe me? I had every motive the law recognizes. And if they investigated Thomas's claims about Mary, what did you do? Frank asked, his phone now forgotten in his hand. I buried him, Henry answered, his voice hollow. Under this tree, beside where I'd found the chest. Covered the grave and planted new grass. By then, people assumed Thomas had left town to escape the memories, just like they assumed Mary had run off to start a new life somewhere else. Josh ran a hand through his hair, visibly processing this revelation. Is that what this is about? You're confessing to manslaughter and improper disposal of a body after half a century. Not just that, Henry said, his gaze now fixed on Carol. There's more. Carol felt her heart racing. What more could there possibly be? The night Thomas died, someone else was here, Henry continued. Someone who saw everything. Who? Carol whispered, though a part of her already knew the answer. Mary, Henry confirmed, tears glistening in his eyes. She hadn't disappeared at all. She'd been hiding in the old hunting cabin on the back 40, too afraid to leave with Thomas because of threats she'd received. Threats from whom? Frank demanded. From my mother, Carol said suddenly, the final piece clicking into place. Mom threatened her own twin to protect our family. Henry nodded grimly. Margaret was terrified of the scandal, of losing everything we'd built. She never meant for things to go so far. When Mary witnessed Thomas's death, she made a decision that would change all our lives forever. Max whined softly, pressing against Henry's leg as if sensing his distress. Mary took Margaret's identity. Carol breathed, the impossible truth dawning on her. The woman I knew as my mother was actually her twin sister. The real Margaret left that night, Henry confirmed, his voice breaking. She couldn't live with what she'd done to her sister, to Thomas. Mary stepped into her life, becoming a mother to children who weren't hers, a wife to a man she barely knew. She did it to protect everyone, including the baby she was carrying. Carol felt the world tilting beneath her feet. So my mother, the woman who raised me, was actually my aunt, and my real mother abandoned us. Henry reached for her hand, his own trembling. Mary loved you as her own, Carol. She became Margaret in every way that mattered. Where did my real mother go? Carol asked, her voice barely audible. Henry turned toward the oak tree, placing his weathered palm against its ancient bark. She never left Whispering Hollow, he said softly. She's been here all along. A stunned silence fell over the group as Henry's words hung in the air. Carol stared at the ground beneath the ancient oak, the implications of her father's revelation sinking in. She's buried here? Josh asked, his voice hushed with disbelief. Next to Thomas? Henry shook his head, his weathered hand still resting on the oak's rough bark. No, Margaret didn't die that night. She couldn't bear to leave completely, couldn't stand to be far from her children. So she stayed in Whispering Hollow, watching from a distance. Frank scoffed. That's impossible. Someone would have recognized her. Not if she changed her appearance, Henry replied. Cut her hair, dyed it. Started wearing glasses. And in a small town like this, people see what they expect to see. Carol's mind raced through memories of her childhood, searching for a familiar face that might have been her mother in disguise. Who was she? Who did she become? Henry's eyes, the same piercing blue as Carol's own, filled with tears. Ellie Henderson. Ellie. Carol gasped, thinking of the elderly neighbor who had brought baked goods every Thursday for decades, who had found Henry tied to the tree just days ago. Ellie is my mother? She moved away for a few years, then came back with a new identity, Henry explained. Bought the small property adjoining ours. She couldn't stay away from her children, from the land she loved. Does she know that you know? Josh asked, trying to process this family bombshell. We never spoke of it directly, Henry admitted. Not until Mary, the woman you knew as Margaret, was diagnosed with cancer. On her deathbed, she made me promise to tell you the truth someday. After she passed, Ellie and I acknowledged what we both had known for years. She's been waiting for me to fulfill that promise. Carol sank to her knees on the damp earth, overwhelmed. All these years, my mother was just across the fence line, watching me grow up, attending my school events, my wedding. Her voice broke. Why didn't she claim me? She believed you were better off with Mary, Henry said gently. Mary was a wonderful mother to you and Rob. Margaret, Ellie, she carried the guilt of abandoning her family, of threatening her own sister. She didn't feel worthy of being your mother. Frank, who had remained suspiciously quiet, suddenly spoke up. This changes the property situation entirely. His accountant's mind was already calculating angles. If Ellie Henderson is actually Margaret Collins, then she has a legal claim to half this ranch. For God's sake, Frank, Carol exploded, rising to her feet. My entire identity has just been shattered, and you're worried about property rights. I'm trying to protect our interests, Frank defended. This complicates the AgriCorp deal significantly. Josh stepped between them. No one's selling anything to AgriCorp, he stated firmly. Not while there's a Collins alive to work this land. Max barked sharply, drawing their attention away from the brewing argument. The golden retriever had moved several yards away and was digging frantically at the ground near a cluster of wild roses. What's he doing? Carol asked, grateful for the distraction. He's been obsessed with that spot for weeks, Henry said, moving toward the dog with his halting gait. Always digging there when he thinks no one's watching. Josh joined Max, kneeling beside the shallow hole the dog had created. There's something here, he announced, brushing away soil with his hands. Metal, looks like a tin box. Carol and Henry gathered around as Josh extracted a rusted tin container from the earth. The lid was sealed with wax that had long since hardened. Open it, Henry urged. Josh carefully broke the wax seal and pried open the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. It's a diary, Josh said, opening to the first page. Dated 1971. Mary's diary, Henry breathed. She must have buried it before taking Margaret's place. Carol took the journal with trembling hands. May I? Henry nodded, and Carol began to read aloud from the faded ink. April 15th, 1971. I carry Thomas's child beneath my heart, a secret joy in the midst of so much fear. Margaret says we must leave, that the scandal would destroy us all. But her words carry a threat beneath them. My own sister, my mirror image, has become a stranger to me. Carol's voice faltered as she turned the page. There's so much here. Her fear, her love for Thomas, her confusion about what to do. She flipped forward several entries. June 3rd, 1971. Tonight I witnessed something terrible. Thomas is dead, his blood soaking into the earth beneath the oak. It was an accident. I know this in my heart. But who would believe Henry? And who would believe me, the unwed sister carrying a dead man's child? Margaret has proposed an unthinkable solution. Frank checked his watch impatiently. This is all very dramatic, but shut up, Frank, Carol said quietly, her attention fixed on the diary's revelations. The final entry was dated June 5th, 1971. Tomorrow, I become Margaret Collins. My sister will leave, taking my name and my shame with her. I will raise her children as my own, sleep beside her husband, live her life, while mine disappears like morning fog. Is this salvation or damnation? I only know that Thomas's child deserves a name, a future, and perhaps, in becoming Margaret, I can finally become the sister she always wanted me to be. Carol closed the diary, her eyes meeting Henry's. She knew, Carol whispered. The woman I called mother knew she wasn't really my mother, yet she loved me completely. She became your mother in every way that mattered, Henry said softly. And I became her husband, though we both knew the truth. Over time, our arrangement became something real, something true. Max whined and pressed against Carol's leg, offering canine comfort in the face of such emotional upheaval. I need to see Ellie, Carol said suddenly, rising to her feet with newfound determination. I need to see my mother. The drive to Ellie Henderson's cottage took less than 5 minutes, but to Carol, it felt like crossing an ocean of time. The modest white house with its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden of native wildflowers had been a fixture of her childhood. How many times had she visited this place, accepting cookies from the kind woman she'd known as her neighbor, never suspecting she was sitting across from her biological mother. Ellie's blue pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway. Frank had refused to come, claiming he needed to make calls about the legal implications of everything they'd learned. Josh had offered to join Carol, but she'd asked for this moment alone. Only Henry accompanied her, his weathered face a mask of nervous anticipation as they approached the front door. "Should we have called first?" Carol asked, hesitating with her hand raised to knock. Henry shook his head. "She's been waiting for this day for 50 years. The door opened before Carol could knock. Ellie Henderson stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face lined with age and worry. But her eyes, Carol saw them now with painful clarity, were the same piercing blue as her own, as Henry's. "You told her," Ellie said to Henry, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was time," Henry replied simply. Ellie's gaze shifted to Carol, and in that moment, the carefully constructed persona of the kindly neighbor fell away. Carol saw beneath it to the woman who had given birth to her, who had watched her grow from a distance, who had sacrificed her identity out of a complex tangle of guilt, love, and atonement. "Margaret," Carol said, testing the name, her voice breaking on the syllables. Ellie, Margaret, reached out a trembling hand to touch Carol's cheek. "I never deserved to hear you call me that," she whispered, tears spilling down her lined face. "Not after what I did." Carol surprised herself by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around the older woman. The embrace was awkward at first, then desperate, as if both women were trying to reclaim 5 decades of lost connection. "Why?" Carol asked when they finally separated, moving into the living room filled with handmade quilts and framed photographs, many showing Carol and her brother Rob at various ages, secretly collected over the years. "Why let Mary take your place?" Margaret gestured for them to sit. Her hands, Carol noticed, were nearly identical to those of the woman she'd called Mother, the same long fingers, the same way of folding them in her lap when nervous. "Fear," Margaret admitted, "and shame. When I threatened Mary about the pregnancy, I became someone I couldn't bear to be. Then Thomas died. I convinced myself everyone would be better without me." "But you stayed close," Henry observed, lowering himself into an armchair with a wince. "I couldn't leave completely," Margaret confessed. "The day I walked away, I vowed I'd never interfere, never reclaim what I'd given up. But I needed to be near enough to know my children were safe, were loved." Her eyes found Carol's. "And you were. Mary loved you fiercely. She became a better mother than I ever could have been." "You don't know that," Carol said, her teacher's instinct to correct rising despite the circumstances. "I do," Margaret insisted gently. "Mary had a gentleness I never possessed. She gave herself completely to being Margaret Collins, wife, mother, pillar of the community. Meanwhile, I was building a life from the fragments of my broken identity." Carol looked around the cottage, seeing it with new eyes. The books carefully arranged on shelves, the well-used writing desk by the window, the paintings of local landscapes. "Did you ever regret your choice?" "Every day and never," Margaret answered with painful honesty. "I regretted losing you and Rob. I regretted the pain I caused. But watching Mary become Margaret, seeing her find happiness with Henry, witnessing how she loved my children, I couldn't regret giving her that chance." "And Thomas's child?" Carol asked softly. "What happened?" Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I miscarried during those first difficult months. Another loss in a season of nothing but loss." Henry reached across the space between them to take Margaret's hand. The gesture carried a half-century of unspoken understanding, of a complicated relationship forged in the shadow of an impossible choice. "I've been tied to this land as surely as if I'd never left it," Margaret continued. "Watching the seasons change, watching you grow up, Carol, seeing you become a teacher, just as I had planned to be before everything changed. Is that why you staged your kidnapping?" Carol asked Henry, turning to her father as the pieces continued to fall into place. "To bring me back so you could finally tell me the truth." Henry nodded, looking suddenly every one of his 78 years. "Mary made me promise on her deathbed that someday I'd tell you everything. But the years passed, and you moved away, built your own life. When the doctor told me my heart was failing, I knew I couldn't take these secrets to my grave." "Your heart," Carol gasped, another revelation hitting her like a physical blow. "You're ill?" Not as bad as all that, Henry assured her unconvincingly. But at my age, borrowed time is all I've got left. I needed to make things right while I still could. A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret rose to answer it, returning moments later with Josh, whose expression was a mixture of urgency and concern. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to come back to the ranch, he said. Frank's meeting with someone from AgriCorp. They're walking the property line right now. Carol stood immediately. He has no right. There's more. Josh continued grimly. Max started digging again, this time by the collapsed section of the barn floor. I think he's found something else. Henry struggled to his feet. That dog has better instincts than most people I know. Margaret hesitated at the threshold of her cottage, a lifetime of self-imposed boundaries making her uncertain. Come with us, Carol said, extending her hand to the woman who was her mother by birth, a stranger by circumstance, and a neighbor by choice. It's time you came home to the Collins Ranch. As the four of them drove back toward the property, the clouds finally parted completely, allowing spring sunshine to bathe the land in golden light. They crested the final hill to see Frank standing with a well-dressed woman beside a luxury SUV, surveying the property with calculating eyes. Beside the barn, Max barked excitedly, still pawing at his latest discovery. What none of them noticed was the elderly Native American woman watching from the edge of the woods, her knowing eyes fixed on the ancient oak tree as she waited for the right moment to approach with truths even older than the secrets the Collins family had just unearthed. The late afternoon sun painted Whispering Hollow in amber hues as Carol, Henry, Josh, and Margaret, the woman everyone had known as Ellie Henderson, approached the main house. Frank stood with a sleek woman in a tailored business suit beside the barn, where Max continued his determined excavation, sending dirt flying behind him. Frank, Carol called out, striding purposefully across the yard. What do you think you're doing? Frank turned, his expression shifting from confident to defensive when he saw the assembled family approaching. Carol, this is Vanessa Woodward from AgriCorp, he explained smoothly. She's brought a revised offer that addresses all our concerns. Our concerns? Carol repeated incredulously. You don't speak for this family, Frank. Vanessa Woodward stepped forward, extending a manicured hand. Mrs. Watson, I understand your emotional attachment to this property, but the offer we're presenting is genuinely exceptional, 30% above market value, plus a consulting position for your husband with our Montana operations. Carol ignored the outstretched hand. A consulting position? So that's what this is about. You've been angling for a job with them all along. Frank's face flushed. Someone in this family needs to be practical. Your father is ill, the ranch is mortgaged to the hilt, and Josh is drowning in debt. This sale solves everything. Except it erases everything we are, Josh interjected, moving to stand beside his aunt. This land isn't just real estate. Max's excited barking grew more insistent. Josh turned toward the dog, who had now dug a significant hole near the collapsed section of barn floor. Hold that thought, he said, jogging over to investigate. Henry stepped forward, his weathered face stern as he addressed the AgriCorp representative. Ms. Woodward, I appreciate your interest in my property, but it's not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever while I draw breath. Mr. Collins, Vanessa replied with practiced patience. With all due respect, you're facing foreclosure within the year if the bank's assessments are accurate. Selling now, on your terms, is the sensible choice. Found something, Josh called out, diverting everyone's attention. He was crouched beside Max, carefully removing what appeared to be an old metal document case from the earth. They gathered around as Josh opened the case, revealing a stack of yellowed documents bound with faded ribbon. Land grants, Josh announced, quickly scanning the brittle papers. These are original documents from the 1860s. Margaret gasped softly. The original Collins land grant. Josh nodded, his expression growing more amazed as he continued reading. Not just that. According to these documents, the Collins land was designated as a protected historical site due to the presence of significant indigenous artifacts found during the initial settlement. What does that mean exactly? Carol asked, looking from the documents to her father. Before Henry could answer, a soft voice spoke from behind them. It means this land was never meant to be divided or developed. They turned to see an elderly Native American woman standing at the edge of the yard. Her silver hair was braided simply, her lined face dignified and knowing. "Sarah Blackfeather," Henry acknowledged with obvious respect. "I didn't know you were back in town." "I felt it was time," Sarah replied, her dark eyes taking in the assembled group. The spirits whispered that buried truths were finally coming to light. "You know each other?" Carol asked, surprised. Henry nodded. "Sarah's family has lived in this region for generations. Her grandfather was the one who showed my grandfather where to build this house, away from the sacred burial grounds on the eastern ridge." Sarah approached slowly, her gaze lingering on the documents in Josh's hands. "Those papers recognize what my people always knew, that this land holds memories older than any of us, stories buried in the soil alongside those who came before." Vanessa Woodward cleared her throat impatiently. "This is all very interesting folklore, but it doesn't change the financial realities." "Actually, it does," Josh interrupted, a slow smile spreading across his face as he continued examining the documents. "According to these papers, the Collins family was granted this land with the explicit responsibility to preserve the historical and cultural sites it contains. If these documents are authenticated, they would invalidate any attempt to develop this property commercially." "That's absurd," Frank sputtered. "Ancient papers can't possibly override modern zoning laws." "They can if they establish the land as a protected historical site," Josh countered. "These documents detail specific indigenous artifacts found on the property: pottery, tools, ceremonial items dating back centuries. The original land grant was contingent on the Collins family serving as stewards of this cultural heritage." Henry's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The stories," he breathed. "All those tall tales my father and grandfather told about this land being sacred, about treasures hidden in the soil, they weren't just stories. They were truths disguised as legends," Sarah confirmed, "passed down from one generation to the next, keeping the knowledge alive even when it couldn't be spoken plainly." Carol turned to her father, realization dawning. "So the chest of jewelry you found might actually be artifacts," Henry finished. "Part of what we were meant to protect all along." Max barked again, drawing their attention to yet another discovery: a small wooden box the dog had unearthed near the document case. Josh carefully wiped away the dirt and opened it to reveal a collection of intricately carved stone pieces, their surfaces etched with symbols none of them recognized. Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the box from Josh. "These are teaching stones," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Used by my ancestors to pass down our creation stories." "They're beautiful," Carol said softly. "And absolutely priceless," Sarah added, looking pointedly at Vanessa Woodward. "Items like these would trigger immediate protection under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act." The AgriCorp representative's confident facade finally cracked. "This complicates matters considerably. I believe that's corporate speak for we're no longer interested," Josh said with undisguised satisfaction. Frank looked as if he might protest further, but the unified front of the Collins family, plus one neighbor who was, they now knew, much more than she appeared, silenced whatever objections he might have raised. As Vanessa Woodward made a hasty departure, Carol turned to face her husband. "You and I need to have a serious conversation about our future, Frank. But not today. Today is for family." Frank nodded stiffly, retreating to his car without another word. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Collins property as they gathered on the porch. Henry, Carol, Josh, Margaret, and Sarah, with Max stretched contentedly at their feet. The revelations of the past days had transformed them all, reshaping their understanding of who they were and what this land meant. "So what happens now?" Josh asked, breaking the contemplative silence. Henry's weathered hand found Margaret's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of a connection that had endured despite everything that had tried to sever it. "Now we do what the Collins family has always done," Henry replied, his gaze sweeping across the land that had sustained them for generations. "We protect what matters. We honor our past, and we build a future worthy of those who came before us." Carol looked at her father, this stubborn, secretive man who had orchestrated an elaborate ruse to bring his family back together, and at the woman who had given birth to her, who had sacrificed her identity yet remained close enough to witness her daughter's life unfold. "I think," Carol said slowly, "that I might extend my leave of absence from teaching. Someone needs to document these findings properly, To record our family's history while we still have people who remember it. Josh smiled, the first genuine smile Carol had seen from him since his arrival. And I might know someone who could use a country veterinarian. Heard they're shorthanded at the clinic in town. 2 Collins back on Collins land, Henry observed, satisfaction evident in his voice. As it should be. Sarah Blackfeather nodded approvingly. The circle completes itself. What was broken begins to heal. As darkness fell over Whispering Hollow, Max trotted to the edge of the porch and barked once at the ancient oak tree silhouetted against the twilight sky. The loyal retriever who had started this journey by finding Henry tied to that tree now seemed to be acknowledging the completion of a cycle, the resolution of secrets long buried. In the spring of the following year, Carol planted a sapling beside the old oak, a new tree to stand watch over the Collins land for generations to come. As she patted the soil around its tender roots, she thought about the complex legacy her family had inherited, the pain and secrets of the past, the responsibilities of the present, and the promise of a future where truth, however difficult, no longer remained buried. And Max, his golden coat now touched with silver around his muzzle, lay nearby watching, the faithful guardian of a family finally made whole. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched until this point, comment, "I watched until the end," and share your opinion about this story. And don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's very exciting.